The morning of April 18th, 1943, 50 feet above the Coral Sea, 1,400 horsepower, Allison engines roaring through tropical humidity. Major John Mitchell checked his wristwatch against the compass mounted specially in his cockpit. 2 hours into dead reckoning, navigation across 430 miles of open ocean. No landmarks, no radio contact, just speed and heading calculated to intercept a target that would arrive on schedule with Japanese punctuality. The 16 P-38 Lightnings stretched out in formation behind him, each carrying enough fuel for exactly 10 minutes of combat. Any longer, and they would not make it home. Mitchell's mission was simple in concept, nearly impossible in execution. Find Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto in the sky over Bougainville and kill him before he landed. The architect of Pearl Harbor would be traveling in a Mitsubishi Betty bomber with 60 escorts. The Americans had his exact itinerary, decoded from Japanese naval cipher 4 days earlier. Time of departure, route of flight, altitude, arrival time. Everything except which of 2 Betty bombers would carry the man who personified Japanese naval power. The question was not whether the Americans could intercept Yamamoto. The question was whether they could navigate across empty ocean flying lower than a 10-story building, arrive within minutes of their calculated intercept time, destroy their target, and survive the engagement with enough fuel to make it back to Guadalcanal. Mitchell figured the odds at 1,000 to 1. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Operation Vengeance represented the convergence of 3 distinct intelligence capabilities that would define modern warfare. The first was cryptographic breakthrough. On April the 14th, 1943, multiple American listening stations intercepted a Japanese naval message encoded in JN25D cipher. The transmission originated from Rabaul and addressed commanders of Base Unit No. 1, the 11th Air Flotilla, and the 26th Air Flotilla. The message passed through Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor, where Navy cryptographers, working in shifts, decoded what would become the most valuable intercept of the Pacific War. Among the cryptographers was John Paul Stevens, who would later serve on the Supreme Court. Their work revealed message NTF 13155, containing Admiral Yamamoto's complete travel schedule for April 18th. The itinerary specified departure from Rabaul at 600 hours Tokyo time aboard a medium bomber with fighter escort. Destination, Balale Airfield near Bougainville. Arrival time, 800 hours Tokyo time. The precision was characteristic of Yamamoto, whose punctuality had become legendary throughout the Imperial Japanese Navy. The second capability was strategic intelligence assessment. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, Fleet Intelligence Officer at Pearl Harbor, received the decoded message and immediately understood its significance. Layton had known Yamamoto personally from his time as naval attaché in Tokyo. They had played cards together. Layton understood that Yamamoto's habit of maintaining exact schedules made him vulnerable to intercept. He brought the decrypt to Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet. Nimitz read the message and asked Layton 2 questions. Do we try to get him? Would the Japanese be able to replace him with someone better? Layton's response shaped the operation. No other Japanese admiral held the same stature among the Japanese people, possessed the same naval experience, or commanded the same respect from subordinates. Yamamoto was irreplaceable. His death would damage Japanese naval morale more than losing a major battle. The intelligence went from Nimitz to Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox. According to several accounts, Knox presented the information to President Franklin Roosevelt. The president's alleged response became part of military legend: "Get Yamamoto." Whether Roosevelt actually said those words remains disputed. No written order exists in official records, but the authorization came through channels on April 17th. The mission would proceed. The third capability was operational execution. Vice Admiral William Halsey, commanding South Pacific Forces, received authorization to plan the intercept. Halsey consulted with Rear Admiral Mark Mitchell, Air Commander in the Solomons. Mitchell had captained the carrier Hornet during the Doolittle raid, exactly 1 year earlier. Now he saw opportunity for another long-range surprise attack, this time using Army Air Force's fighters. The target would be 400 miles from Guadalcanal. No Navy or Marine Corps fighter had sufficient range for the mission. The F-4F Wildcat and F-4U Corsair, despite their combat effectiveness, could not fly 800 miles round trip and still have fuel for engagement. Only one aircraft in the theater possessed the necessary range and firepower, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning twin-boom configuration. Two Allison V-1710 engines producing 1,400 horsepower each, armament of 120mm cannon and 450 caliber machine guns mounted in the nose. Maximum speed 360 knots, but range was the critical specification. With external drop tanks, the P-38G could fly approximately 1,000 miles with minimal reserve for combat. It was the only aircraft that could reach Yamamoto and return. Major John Mitchell commanded the 339th Fighter Squadron, stationed at Cookham Field on Guadalcanal. On the afternoon of April 17th, Mitchell reported to the operations dugout at Henderson Field and found himself surrounded by senior Navy and Marine Corps officers. They informed him that American codebreakers had intercepted Yamamoto's travel plans. The Admiral would be flying from Rabaul to Bougainville the following morning. Mitchell would lead the intercept mission. The planning session immediately revealed inter-service tensions. Navy officers described the mission in nautical terms: attack from the port quarter, intercept the subchaser transport. Mitchell stopped the discussion. Port quarter? What does that mean? I don't know the difference between a subchaser and a sub. What if there are several boats? How do we tell them apart? What if the guy can swim? We're fighter pilots. We should take him in the air. Mitchell settled the matter. He's right, we get him in the air. Before leaving, Mitchell requested a Navy compass for better navigation over water. Lieutenant Colonel Luther Moore provided a ship's compass that would be mounted in Mitchell's cockpit. The mission would launch the following morning. Mitchell spent the night working out every detail with members of Mitchell's staff. The straight-line distance from Guadalcanal to Balal was approximately 400 miles, but flying directly would expose the P-38s to Japanese radar stations and observation posts throughout the Solomon Islands. Mitchell plotted a roundabout approach, 600 miles south and west, over open ocean. The fighters would fly at altitudes no greater than 50 feet, low enough to avoid radar detection, but high enough to clear the waves. Total distance, 1,000 miles round trip. Fuel consumption would be critical. Marine Major John Condon prepared an initial flight plan, but Mitchell discarded it. The airspeeds and time estimates did not match his calculations for optimal intercept. With several pilots assisting, Mitchell worked backward from the target. Yamamoto's itinerary indicated arrival at Balale at 0800 Tokyo time, which corresponded to 0945 at Guadalcanal. Mitchell calculated an intercept time of 0935, catching the bombers as they descended 10 minutes before landing. He drew 4 precisely calculated legs with compass headings and elapsed times for each segment. A 5th leg curved in a search pattern in case Yamamoto was not spotted at the calculated intercept point. The navigation would rely entirely on dead reckoning, compass heading, airspeed, and elapsed time. No visual landmarks, no radio communication. Mitchell would navigate for 16 aircraft across 430 miles of featureless ocean and arrive within minutes of schedule. 18 P-38s were designated for the mission, 16 for the attack, 2 as spares. The aircraft came from 3 squadrons of the 347th Fighter Group, the 12th, 339th, and 70th Fighter Squadrons. Marine Corps technicians worked through the night fitting special fuel tanks. Each P-38 carried one standard 165-gallon drop tank under each wing. Additionally, a limited supply of 330-gallon tanks had been flown up from New Guinea. Each Lightning received one large tank to replace one of the smaller tanks. Despite the size difference, the tanks were positioned close enough to the aircraft's center of gravity to avoid performance problems. The mission required specific tactical organization. 4 P-38s formed the Killer Flight, designated to attack the Betty bombers. Captain Thomas Lanphier led this element with First Lieutenant Rex Barber as his wingman. First Lieutenant Baseby Holmes led the second element with First Lieutenant Raymond Hine as his wingman. The remaining 12 aircraft would climb to 18,000 feet to provide top cover against expected Japanese fighter reaction from Kahili Airfield on Bougainville. Intelligence reported 75 Zeros stationed there. Mitchell assumed Japanese air defense would scramble everything available to protect their fleet commander. The pilots attended a final briefing. Most historians indicate they were not specifically told the target's identity. The cover story claimed Australian coast watchers had spotted an important high-ranking officer boarding an aircraft at Rabaul. But Thomas Alexander Hughes documented that Mitchell informed the assembled pilots they would be intercepting Admiral Yamamoto to provide additional incentive for the mission. Whether the pilots knew they were hunting the architect of Pearl Harbor or simply a high-value target, they understood the mission's importance. Security was absolute. No discussion outside the briefing, no written notes. The pilots committed the flight plan to memory. They studied recognition photographs of the Betty bomber and the Zero fighter. They reviewed egress routes in case of combat damage or fuel emergency. Then they tried to sleep, though few succeeded. Palm Sunday, April 18th, 1943, the anniversary of Paul Revere's midnight ride in 1775, exactly 1 year after the Doolittle raid on Japan. Mitchell woke before dawn and checked weather reports. Conditions were acceptable. Some haze over Bougainville, but otherwise clear. The P-38s began starting engines at 0700 hours. Mitchell took off at 0725 in his aircraft, nicknamed Mitch's Squitch. The Killer Flight followed immediately behind. Lieutenant Jim McClanahan's aircraft suffered a flat tire during takeoff roll and aborted. Lieutenant Joe Moore's drop tanks failed to feed fuel properly. He aborted after takeoff. The mission continued with 16 aircraft instead of 18. Lieutenant Baseby Holmes and Lieutenant Raymond Hine moved up to fill the gaps in the Killer Flight. The formation assembled over Guadalcanal and departed at 7:30 hours. 2 hours and 5 minutes until planned intercept, 430 miles of ocean navigation ahead. Mitchell led the formation at 50 feet altitude. Wave tops passed beneath the aircraft close enough to count. Some pilots counted sharks in the water below. Others counted pieces of driftwood, most simply concentrated on maintaining formation and conserving fuel. The cockpit temperature climbed as tropical sun heated the plexiglass canopies. Pilots sweated through their flight suits. Mitchell fought drowsiness brought on by engine drone and smooth air. He later described receiving what felt like light taps from the man upstairs to keep him awake during critical navigation points. The route consisted of 5 calculated legs. Mitchell flew each segment by compass heading and elapsed time, checking his wristwatch against calculated waypoints. No radio communication. Complete silence to avoid Japanese radio direction finding. The formation changed course at precise intervals, turning from one heading to the next, based entirely on Mitchell's navigation calculations. Any error would mean arriving too early or too late, too far north or south. Missing the intercept by even a few miles would make finding Yamamoto impossible in the vastness of the Solomon Islands airspace. At Rabaul, Admiral Yamamoto prepared for departure despite warnings from subordinate commanders. Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura, commander of ground forces at Rabaul, had nearly been killed on a similar flight 2 months earlier. He urged Yamamoto to cancel the inspection tour or at least change the schedule. Yamamoto declined. His presence at forward bases would boost morale following defeats at Guadalcanal and Midway. Japanese forces needed to see their commander sharing their risks. On the morning of April 18th, Yamamoto emerged from his quarters wearing a plain khaki-green service uniform instead of the white ceremonial dress uniform typically worn for inspection visits. Several staff officers noted the choice, but said nothing. Yamamoto boarded Mitsubishi G4M1 Betty bomber number 323 of the 705th Air Group. He sat in a passenger seat on the left side of the fuselage, behind the pilot. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki Chief of Staff, boarded Betty number 326. Ugaki was recovering from dengue fever and looked forward to sleeping during the flight. 6 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters from the 204th Air Group formed the escort. They would fly 1,500 feet above and behind the bombers in 2 V formations of 3 aircraft each. Among the escort pilots was Petty Officer First Class Kenji Yanagiya, a veteran with over 100 combat missions. The formation took off from Rabaul at precisely 0600 hours Tokyo time. Yamamoto's punctuality held true. The 2 formations flew toward each other, separated by hundreds of miles of ocean. Yamamoto's Bettys cruised at 6,500 feet altitude, heading southeast toward Bougainville. Mitchell's P-38s skimmed the wave tops 500 miles to the south, heading northwest on their complex navigation route. The timing had to be precise. Arrive too early, and the Japanese would spot the P-38 circling. Arrive too late, and Yamamoto would land before the intercept. Mitchell maintained strict altitude discipline. At 50 feet, the P-38s remained below Japanese radar coverage, but any pilot who climbed even a few hundred feet risked detection. The formation stayed on the deck. At 09:25, after flying 227 minutes by compass and time alone, Mitchell made the final turn to the northeast, less than 20 miles off Bougainville's western coast. Time to climb and search. The P-38s pulled up from wave level, accelerating through 3,000 feet. Mitchell scanned the sky ahead. The killer flight dropped back slightly, ready to attack, while the top cover climbed to 18,000 feet. At 09:34, exactly 1 minute before calculated intercept time, First Lieutenant Douglas Canning broke radio silence with a subdued call. Bogies, 11 o'clock high. 2 Betty bombers at 4,000 feet, descending toward Balale. 6 Zero fighters, 1,500 feet higher, in 2 V formations. The Japanese formation was precisely on schedule, exactly where Mitchell's navigation had predicted. The timing was so perfect, it seemed choreographed. Mitchell had navigated across 430 miles of featureless ocean using only compass, airspeed, and wristwatch. He had arrived within 1 minute of calculated intercept time at the exact location where Yamamoto would appear. It was, arguably, the most extraordinary feat of dead-reckoning navigation in military aviation history. But navigation was complete. Now came combat. Mitchell keyed his radio. "All right, skin your tanks and climb." The P-38s jettisoned their external fuel tanks and advanced throttles to military power. The Allison engines responded with increased roar as the fighters accelerated upward. 12 P-38s of the cover flight continued climbing toward 18,000 feet to intercept expected Japanese reinforcements from Kahili. 4 P-38s of the killer flight turned toward the Betty bombers, now diving toward treetop level. The Japanese pilots had spotted the Americans and reacted immediately. The escort Zeros broke formation and dove to engage. The Bettys pushed their noses down, trading altitude for speed in desperate runs toward the safety of Balal Airfield. Captain Lanfear and Lieutenant Barber closed on the bombers from below and behind. The range decreased rapidly. The Bettys were fast, capable of nearly 300 miles per hour at sea level, but the P-38s were faster. Lanfear and Barber pulled up in pursuit as Zeros dove to intercept them. The sky filled with aircraft maneuvering at high speed and low altitude. Lieutenant Barber focused on the lead Betty, now flying barely 50 feet above the jungle canopy. He positioned his P-38 for an attack run from the bomber's rear quarter. The range closed to 400 yards, 300 yards, 200 yards. Barber's finger found the trigger, 120mm cannon, 4 50 caliber machine guns, combined rate of fire, approximately 600 rounds per minute. At 200 yards, Barber opened fire. The first burst struck the Betty's right engine nacelle. Pieces of cowling flew off. Black smoke poured from the damaged engine. The bomber shuddered but maintained course. Barber corrected his aim and fired again. This burst hit the left engine and walked across the fuselage. 50 caliber rounds penetrated the thin aluminum skin and detonated inside the bomber. The Betty rolled violently to the left and nosed down into the jungle. The impact occurred approximately 1 mile northwest of Bougainville. A column of black smoke marked the crash site. Barber did not know which Betty carried Yamamoto. He immediately turned toward the second bomber, which had continued its dive toward Balal. The bomber was low over the water, engines at maximum power. Barber closed the distance and opened fire. His rounds struck the Betty's tail section and walked forward toward the fuselage. The bomber began trailing smoke but continued flying. Barber fired until his ammunition ran low, then broke off the attack. Behind him, the first Betty burned in the jungle. Ahead, the second Betty struggled toward the coastline, trailing smoke and losing altitude. Other P-38s from the killer flight engaged the damaged bomber. It crashed into the water near the shore. Above the treetops, the remaining P-38s tangled with Zero fighters. Lieutenant Holmes claimed a Zero shot down. Lieutenant Barber also claimed a Zero during the melee, though Japanese records would later show no Zero losses during the engagement. The top cover briefly engaged additional Zeros, arriving from Kahili, but made no confirmed kills. Lieutenant Hines, P-38, disappeared during the combat. He was presumed to have crashed into the water after being damaged by Zero fire. Kenji Yanagiya, the experienced Zero pilot, later told Major Mitchell that he might have been responsible for Hines' loss after heavily damaging a P-38 that had not dropped its external tanks. With fuel critical, Mitchell ordered the formation to break contact and head for home. The P-38s turned southeast and dove back to wave level for the return flight, 400 miles, to Guadalcanal. Everyone was running on fumes. Lieutenant Holmes had so little fuel remaining that he was forced to land in the Russell Islands rather than continue to Guadalcanal. His engine quit during landing rollout. As the P-38s approached Henderson Field, Captain Lanfear broke radio silence. His transmission violated operational security, but captured the mission's emotional impact. "That son of a bitch will not be dictating any peace terms in the White House." The statement referred to a widely reported but fabricated quote attributed to Yamamoto about dictating surrender terms in Washington. Yamamoto had never made such a statement, but Americans believed he had. Lanfear's radio call confirmed mission success. 1 Betty bomber had crashed in the jungle. 1 Betty bomber had crashed in the water. The pilots did not know which bomber carried Yamamoto, but both targets had been destroyed. The following morning, April 19th, a Japanese rescue party led by Army Engineer Lieutenant Hamasuna reached the jungle crash site. They found the wreckage of Betty number 323 scattered across a small clearing. Admiral Yamamoto had been thrown clear of the fuselage, still strapped in his seat beneath a tree. His white-gloved hand gripped the hilt of his katana sword. His head was tilted down, as if in deep thought. Lieutenant Hamasuna said Yamamoto was instantly recognizable despite the circumstances. The Navy doctor conducting the post-mortem examination found 2 .50 caliber bullet wounds. 1 round had entered the back of Yamamoto's left shoulder. The second round had entered the left side of his lower jaw and exited above his right eye. The head wound had killed him. Medical analysis indicated death occurred before the aircraft crashed, meaning Yamamoto died from gunfire rather than impact. These violent details were hidden from the Japanese public on orders from above. The medical report was altered to obscure how the admiral had died. Admiral Ugaki survived the crash of the second Betty into the water near the shore. He was one of 4 survivors, pulled from the wreckage. The impact at full speed had knocked him unconscious. He awoke floating in the ocean and was rescued by Japanese personnel responding to the crash. Ugaki learned of Yamamoto's death later that day. His journal entry recorded the loss as the most significant blow to Japanese naval morale since the beginning of the war. The Americans initially kept the mission success classified to protect their code-breaking capabilities. If the Japanese discovered that their naval cipher had been compromised, they would change encryption systems and eliminate American intelligence advantage. Navy staff prepared a cover story claiming that Australian coast watchers in the Solomon Islands had observed a high-ranking Japanese officer boarding an aircraft at Rabaul and had radioed the information to American forces. The deception proved effective. Japanese intelligence investigated how the Americans had learned of Yamamoto's flight schedule but never discovered the code-breaking operation. The Japanese government did not announce Yamamoto's death until May 21st, more than a month after the mission. The delay allowed time to investigate the incident and prepare the Japanese public for the news. When the announcement finally came, it described Yamamoto as having died during combat operations at the front. No details were provided about the circumstances. The nation mourned. Yamamoto had been Japan's most prominent naval officer, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, commander of the combined fleet. His death represented not merely the loss of a military leader, but the symbolic end of Japanese naval supremacy in the Pacific. Captain Watanabe and his staff cremated Yamamoto's remains at Bougainville. The ashes were returned to Tokyo aboard the battleship Musashi, Yamamoto's last flagship. The nation prepared for a state funeral. End of part 1. Approximately 3,100 words. I'll continue with part 2 after you give me the word. The first part establishes the setup, context, and the mission execution. Part 2 will cover the aftermath, the controversy, and the legacy of Operation Vengeance. Would you like me to proceed with part 2 now? Part 2 of the script. Final. On June the 5th, 1943, Japan conducted a state funeral for Admiral Yamamoto. Thousands lined the streets of Tokyo as his funeral procession moved through the city. He received posthumous promotion to Marshal Admiral and was awarded the Order of the Chrysanthemum, First Class. Part of his ashes were interred at Tama Cemetery in Tokyo, with the remainder sent to his ancestral home in Nagaoka. The ceremony represented Japan's effort to honor its fallen commander while concealing from the public how completely American intelligence had penetrated Japanese communications. The funeral became a demonstration of national unity in the face of mounting defeats. But beneath the pageantry lay a strategic reality that Japanese leadership could not ignore. Yamamoto's death had occurred because American codebreakers could read their most secure naval cipher in near real time. The controversy over who actually shot down Yamamoto's bomber began almost immediately after the mission. Captain Thomas Lanphier filed the initial combat report and claimed credit for destroying the first Betty bomber. His account described engaging 0 escorts, shooting down 1 Zero fighter, then attacking the lead bomber with a high deflection shot that took off its wing. Lieutenant Rex Barber's account contradicted Lanphier's version in nearly every detail. Barber described approaching the bombers from behind, engaging the lead Betty with multiple firing passes from the rear quarter and watching it crash into the jungle trailing smoke. He then attacked the second Betty, which crashed into the water. The two accounts could not be reconciled. Both pilots claimed to have shot down the first bomber, which crashed in the jungle. Only one bomber crashed in the jungle. The other crashed in the water. Physical evidence and eyewitness testimony would be necessary to determine who deserved credit. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Major John Mitchell, as mission commander, was nominated for the Medal of Honor for his extraordinary navigation and leadership. But in October 1943, Time magazine published an article about Operation Vengeance that mentioned Lanphier by name. The unauthorized disclosure violated operational security and outraged Navy leadership. The compromise potentially revealed to Japanese intelligence that American code breaking had enabled the mission. As punishment for the security breach, Mitchell's Medal of Honor nomination was downgraded to the Navy Cross. This became the standard award presented to all pilots of the killer flight. Mitchell accepted the downgrade without complaint, but the decision rankled for decades among those who understood what his navigation had accomplished. The debate over who shot down Yamamoto intensified after the war when additional evidence became available. Zero pilot Kenji Yanagiya, who had flown escort for Yamamoto, provided testimony to American investigators. Yanagiya stated he had observed one Betty bomber crash into the jungle after being struck by gunfire from a P-38 approaching from the rear. The bomber's wing had not been shot off, as Lanphier claimed. Instead, the aircraft had rolled inverted and dove into the trees while trailing smoke. Yanagiya's description matched Barber's account exactly. The Japanese pilot also noted that the attack occurred approximately 20 to 30 seconds after the P-38 opened fire, consistent with a sustained firing pass from behind rather than a single high-deflection shot from the side. In 1985, the Air Force Historical Research Agency convened a panel to review all available evidence regarding the Yamamoto shootdown. The panel examined combat reports, pilot testimony, Japanese records, and physical evidence from the crash site. Panel members included military historians and combat veterans with expertise in air-to-air tactics. The review concluded that both Lanphier and Barber should receive shared credit for destroying Yamamoto's bomber because both pilots had fired at Betty bombers and both claimed the jungle crash. The decision satisfied no one. Lanphier continued claiming sole credit until his death in 1987. Most newspaper obituaries credited him with killing Yamamoto, reinforcing the narrative he had spent decades promoting. Barber contested the shared credit ruling in military publications and historical forums until his death in 2001. He maintained that physical evidence and eyewitness testimony clearly showed he had shot down Yamamoto's aircraft from behind, while Lanphier had been too far away to achieve an effective firing solution. Additional evidence emerged in the years following the Air Force panel decision. In 2003, the governor and legislature of Oregon commissioned an analysis of the crash site. Investigators examined the wreckage and traced the paths of bullet impacts through the aircraft structure. The analysis determined that all damage to Yamamoto's bomber was consistent with sustained fire from directly behind the aircraft, not from a side angle, as Lanphier's account described. The bullet trajectory matched Barber's description of his attack run. In 2006, Doug Canning, a P-38 pilot who had flown on Operation Vengeance, published a letter in Air Force magazine describing the controversy. Canning stated he had been friends with both Lanphier and Barber. He explained that Lanphier had written the official mission report, the medal citations, and several magazine articles about the mission. Lanphier's control of the narrative had allowed him to shape public perception of events. Barber had been willing to accept shared credit until Lanphier showed him an unpublished manuscript claiming sole credit for the shootdown. After reading Lanphier's version, Barber began actively contesting the attribution. In 2024, Air Force historian Daniel Holman, who had been a member of the 1985 review panel, published new conclusions after examining additional evidence that had emerged over the decades. Holman stated explicitly that he had become convinced Rex Barber alone should receive credit for shooting down Yamamoto's aircraft. The evidence showed Lanphier had been too far from the bomber to achieve the firing position he described. His angle of attack would not have allowed him to destroy a fast-moving target from the side. Moreover, the wreckage evidence and autopsy findings showed Yamamoto's plane had been hit from behind, exactly as Barber described. Lanphier's claim did not match physical reality. Despite Holman's conclusion and the supporting evidence, the Air Force never officially reversed its 1991 ruling that gave each pilot half credit for the kill. Bureaucratic inertia and concern about posthumously dishonoring Lanphier prevented reconsideration of the decision. The controversy became a permanent feature of Operation Vengeance history, demonstrating how difficult it could be to establish historical truth when witnesses provided conflicting accounts. The strategic impact of Yamamoto's death remained debated among military historians and intelligence analysts for decades. Some argued the mission represented a decisive blow to Japanese naval leadership that hastened the war's end. Others contended that Yamamoto's elimination had minimal effect on Japan's strategic position, which was already deteriorating due to industrial and logistical disadvantages. The evidence supported nuanced conclusions. Commander Masatake Okumiya, an air staff officer aboard carrier Ryujo, who had known Yamamoto personally, later co-authored a book with Zero designer Jiro Horikoshi. In the book, published in 1956, Okumiya stated that the capture of the Akutan Zero and the killing of Yamamoto were no less serious than the defeat at Midway and did much to hasten Japan's final defeat. This assessment came from someone with direct knowledge of Japanese naval operations and strategic planning. Okumiya understood that Yamamoto's death damaged morale throughout the fleet and eliminated the one commander capable of challenging Imperial General Headquarters on strategic decisions. However, other analysts noted that Japan's strategic position had already become untenable by April 1943. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 had destroyed 4 Japanese carriers and eliminated the core of experienced naval aviators. The Guadalcanal campaign from August 1942 to February 1943 had consumed additional resources and personnel that Japan could not replace. American industrial production had reached levels that made Japanese victory mathematically impossible. By spring 1943, the United States was launching escort carriers faster than Japan could build destroyers. American aircraft production exceeded Japanese output by factors of 10 or more. The material balance had shifted irreversibly in favor of the Allies. Yamamoto's death could not alter these fundamental realities. His replacement, Admiral Minachi Koga, proved competent, but faced the same insurmountable challenges. Japan's loss of strategic initiative had occurred before Yamamoto died, not because of his death. The most significant impact of Operation Vengeance may have been psychological rather than strategic. Japanese naval personnel had viewed Yamamoto as embodying the fighting spirit of the fleet. His death demonstrated that even the most protected commanders could be targeted and eliminated. The realization that American intelligence could track individual officers' movements created paranoia throughout Japanese command structures. Senior officers became reluctant to fly inspection tours or visit forward bases. This isolation from frontline units degraded Japanese tactical decision-making as commanders lost direct knowledge of combat conditions. Additionally, the mission validated American code-breaking operations as a decisive intelligence advantage. The ability to read Japanese naval cipher had enabled both the Midway victory and the Yamamoto intercept. These successes demonstrated the strategic value of signals intelligence and justified continued investment in cryptographic operations. The lessons learned would prove crucial during the Cold War when signals intelligence became central to American national security strategy. For the P-38 pilots who flew Operation Vengeance, the mission represented the culmination of months of training and combat experience in the South Pacific. The Lightning had proven itself as the only American fighter with sufficient range to reach targets throughout the Solomon Islands. Its twin-engine configuration provided redundancy during long overwater flights. The nose-mounted armament allowed precise shooting without convergence issues. The aircraft's high-altitude performance exceeded that of Japanese fighters. But the P-38 also had limitations that became apparent during extended combat operations. Compressibility problems at high speed made the aircraft difficult to control during dives from altitude. The cockpit heating system was inadequate for operations above 20,000 feet, causing frostbite injuries among pilots flying bomber escort missions over Europe. The complex turbo-supercharger systems required extensive maintenance that forward bases struggled to provide. Despite these challenges, the Lightning remained the dominant American fighter in the Pacific theater through 1944, when the P-51 Mustang began arriving in significant numbers. Major John Mitchell continued flying combat missions after Operation Vengeance and eventually achieved 11 confirmed aerial victories during World War II. He flew both P-39 Airacobras and P-38 Lightnings during his combat tour. After the war, Mitchell remained in military service and flew missions during the Korean War, achieving 4 additional confirmed kills for a career total of 15 victories. He received the Navy Cross For Operation Vengeance, the Distinguished Service Cross for his overall combat record in the Guadalcanal campaign, and numerous other decorations. Mitchell retired as a colonel and died in 1995. Historians consistently credited him with executing one of the most extraordinary navigation feats in military aviation history. His ability to lead 16 fighters across 430 miles of ocean and arrive within 1 minute of calculated intercept time using only compass and wristwatch demonstrated navigation skill that modern pilots with GPS and inertial systems would find difficult to match. Lieutenant Rex Barber requested return to combat after his tour ended in June 1943. Late that year, he joined the 449th Fighter Squadron in China, still flying P-38s. He eventually achieved 5 confirmed aerial victories, becoming an ace. Barber received the Navy Cross for Operation Vengeance with a citation, noting he had destroyed 1 Japanese bomber at such close range that fragments from the explosion lodged in the wings of his plane. The citation also credited him with shooting down and escorting Zero fighter, though Japanese records did not confirm this claim. Barber married Margaret Smith in October 1947 and had 2 sons. He remained in military service until retiring. Barber spent decades after the war contesting Lanfear's claim of sole credit for shooting down Yamamoto. He provided testimony to multiple review boards, wrote articles for military publications, and corresponded with historians researching the mission. His position was vindicated by forensic analysis of the crash site, but official Air Force records never reflected the change. Barber died in July 2001. Captain Thomas Lanfear became one of the most celebrated fighter pilots of World War II, based on his claim of shooting down Yamamoto. He received the Navy Cross, extensive press coverage and speaking engagements throughout the country. After the war, Lanfear pursued a career in business and Republican Party politics, leveraging his fame as Yamamoto's killer. He wrote numerous articles about Operation Vengeance and appeared in documentaries about the Pacific War. Lanfear maintained his claim of sole credit until his death in September 1987. His obituaries in major newspapers credited him with killing Yamamoto, demonstrating how effectively he had controlled the public narrative. Modern historians generally conclude that Lanfear's account was incorrect and that Barber deserved credit for the shootdown. But Lanfear's version became embedded in popular history through decades of repetition. Lieutenant Besby Holmes, who had replaced McClanahan in the killer flight after the latter's tire blew during takeoff, returned safely from the mission despite running so low on fuel that he was forced to land in the Russell Islands. Holmes continued flying combat missions and survived the war. He attended reunions of Operation Vengeance pilots and provided testimony regarding the events of April 18th. Holmes consistently supported Barber's version of events, stating he had observed Barber pursuing the lead Betty bomber from behind while Lanfear engaged Zero fighters at a distance. Holmes's testimony corroborated the physical evidence and Japanese eyewitness accounts. Lieutenant Raymond Hine, who had replaced Moore in the killer flight after Moore's fuel tanks failed to feed properly, died during the mission. His P-38 disappeared during the engagement with Zero fighters and was never recovered. Japanese pilot Kenji Yanagiya later told Mitchell that he might have shot down Hine's aircraft after damaging it severely during the fight. However, neither Yanagiya nor any other Zero pilot officially claimed a P-38 that day. Hine's loss remained officially attributed to unknown causes, though combat with Japanese fighters was the most likely explanation. The impact of Operation Vengeance on the broader Pacific War manifested in ways that extended beyond Yamamoto's death. The mission demonstrated that American air power could strike targets anywhere within the vast Pacific theater if proper intelligence and planning were available. Japanese commanders became increasingly reluctant to follow predictable schedules or transmit detailed movement information, even using encrypted communications. This caution degraded Japanese command and control as senior officers avoided visiting forward bases where their presence was needed for effective tactical leadership. The psychological impact on Japanese naval personnel proved difficult to quantify, but was consistently reported by post-war interviews with surviving officers. Many described feeling vulnerable after learning that Yamamoto, despite flying with fighter escort at high altitude, had been intercepted and killed by American fighters that should never have known his location. The realization that American intelligence could predict Japanese movements with such precision created a sense of inevitability about the war's outcome. For American forces, Operation Vengeance provided a morale boost that transcended the tactical significance of Yamamoto's death. The mission demonstrated that Pearl Harbor would be avenged, that Japanese aggression would face consequences, that American technical and intelligence capabilities could achieve results that seemed impossible by conventional analysis. News of the mission remained classified through May 1943, but once the Japanese government announced Yamamoto's death, American forces throughout the Pacific understood what had been accomplished. The ability to reach out across 400 miles and eliminate the architect of Pearl Harbor validated the sacrifices being made throughout the theater. It proved that American forces were not merely holding defensive positions, but were capable of offensive operations that could target specific Japanese leaders with surgical precision. The lessons learned from Operation Vengeance influenced American intelligence operations for decades. The success demonstrated the strategic value of signals intelligence when properly exploited through operational action. Code breaking alone provided information, but Operation Vengeance showed how that information could be converted into decisive military advantage. The mission also highlighted the importance of maintaining operational security to protect intelligence sources. The premature disclosure in Time magazine had nearly compromised American code-breaking capabilities and resulted in punishment for the mission commander. Future intelligence operations would emphasize protecting sources even at the cost of limiting credit to personnel involved in successful missions. The balance between recognizing achievement and maintaining security became a permanent tension in intelligence-derived operations. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan, which intensified through 1944 and 1945, drew indirect lessons from Operation Vengeance. If American forces could eliminate specific individuals through precision attack, then precision bombing might achieve strategic objectives more efficiently than area bombing. That this logic proved overly optimistic given the limitations of World War II bombing technology. But the concept of precision strike against high-value targets became central to American air power doctrine in subsequent conflicts. The guided munitions and satellite targeting systems developed during the Cold War and refined in later decades represented the technological evolution of the principles demonstrated during Operation Vengeance. Finding specific targets through intelligence and destroying them with precision weapons became the defining characteristic of American air power by the end of the 20th century. The controversy over who shot down Yamamoto, while frustrating to participants and historians, illustrated broader challenges in establishing historical truth about combat events. Participants often had incomplete information, saw events from limited perspectives, and remembered details incorrectly under the stress of combat. Physical evidence could be ambiguous or destroyed. Witnesses might have biases or motivations that colored their testimony. Establishing what actually happened during brief, violent encounters required careful analysis of multiple sources and willingness to accept uncertainty where evidence was insufficient. The Yamamoto shoot-down controversy persisted for 80 years precisely because the evidence, while strongly supporting Barber's account, could not definitively disprove all aspects of Lanfear's version to the satisfaction of official review boards concerned about posthumously dishonoring a decorated combat veteran. Lieutenant Julius Jacobson, another pilot who flew on Operation Vengeance, provided perhaps the most balanced perspective on the controversy. In 1997, he remarked, "There were 15 of us who survived, and as far as who did the effective shooting, who cares?" His statement captured an important truth. The mission succeeded because 16 pilots executed a nearly impossible plan with precision timing and coordination. Mitchell's navigation brought them to the intercept point. The killer flight engaged the bombers. The top cover prevented Japanese reinforcements from interfering. Everyone returned safely except Hein, whose sacrifice enabled the mission's success. Arguing over individual credit diminished the collective achievement of a team that accomplished something extraordinary through cooperation and skill. Admiral Yamamoto's legacy remained complex and controversial in both Japan and the United States. To Americans, he represented the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and the face of Japanese aggression in the Pacific. His death provided emotional satisfaction as revenge for December 7th, 1941. To Japanese, he represented a tragic figure who had warned against war with America but loyally executed his duty when ordered to do so. Yamamoto had spent years in the United States, studied at Harvard, traveled extensively throughout the country, and understood American industrial capacity better than most Japanese leaders. He had reportedly told superiors that Japan could run wild for 6 months or a year in a war against America, but after that, he had utterly no confidence in victory. This prescient analysis proved accurate. The Midway defeat came exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. Japan never regained the initiative. Yamamoto knew the war was ultimately unwinnable, but fought it professionally nonetheless. The moral questions surrounding targeted assassination of military commanders received limited attention during World War II, but became more prominent in subsequent conflicts. Operation Vengeance represented a deliberate decision to kill a specific individual based on intelligence about his movements. The mission required authorization at the highest levels of American government, though no written order from President Roosevelt has ever been found in official records. Post-war analysis by military lawyers concluded that targeting enemy military commanders during wartime fell within accepted rules of armed conflict. Yamamoto wore a uniform, commanded armed forces, and was engaged in military operations. When killed, his death was no different legally than any other combat casualty. But the precedent established by Operation Vengeance influenced thinking about targeted killings in later decades, when similar operations were conducted against terrorist leaders and insurgent commanders. The technical lessons from Operation Vengeance influenced fighter aircraft design throughout the jet age. The mission had required extreme range, high speed, heavy armament, and the ability to navigate precisely over featureless terrain. These requirements shaped development of post-war fighter aircraft, particularly long-range interceptors designed to protect North American airspace against Soviet bomber attack. The Northrop F-89 Scorpion, Lockheed F-94 Starfire, and other Cold War night fighters incorporated twin-engine configurations, sophisticated radar systems, and heavy armament packages that traced their lineage directly back to the P-38 Lightning. The navigation techniques pioneered by Mitchell and other Pacific Theater pilots influenced development of inertial navigation systems and eventually GPS technology. The ability to navigate precisely over long distances without reference to visual landmarks became a fundamental requirement for modern combat aircraft. By the end of World War II, the P-38 Lightning had compiled an impressive combat record despite its early technical problems. American ace pilots Richard Bong and Thomas Maguire, the two highest-scoring American fighter aces of all time, flew P-38s exclusively in the Pacific Theater. Bong achieved 40 confirmed victories. Maguire achieved 38 confirmed victories. Both men benefited from the Lightning's long-range, heavy armament, and high-altitude performance. The aircraft that had enabled Operation Vengeance proved equally effective in conventional air-to-air combat throughout the Pacific Campaign. Production of the P-38 continued until August 1945, with over 10,000 aircraft manufactured. The Lightning served with distinction in every theater of the war and pioneered tactics and technologies that influenced fighter design for generations. For the families of the pilots who flew Operation Vengeance, the mission represented a defining moment in their loved ones' lives. The men who participated carried the memory of April 18th, 1943, for the rest of their lives. They had been selected for a mission of extraordinary importance, flown farther and fought harder than most combat pilots would ever experience, and succeeded in eliminating the architect of Pearl Harbor. The psychological weight of that achievement, combined with the frustrations of credit disputes and classification restrictions, affected how they processed their wartime experiences. Many veterans of the mission expressed frustration that Mitchell had been denied the Medal of Honor due to security compromises beyond his control. They recognized that his navigation had been the foundation of mission success. Without Mitchell bringing them to the intercept point at precisely the right time, no shoot-down would have occurred, regardless of who fired the fatal shots. The anniversary of Operation Vengeance has been commemorated through military ceremonies, historical publications, and documentary programs. Each April 18th, military historians and aviation enthusiasts remember the mission as one of the most extraordinary feats of World War II. The combination of code-breaking, strategic decision-making, precise planning, dead-reckoning navigation, and combat execution at the limits of aircraft performance created a mission that seemed impossible but succeeded through skill and determination. The men who flew Operation Vengeance demonstrated that American forces could strike anywhere in the Pacific theater when properly supported by intelligence and planning. That capability, more than any single victory, signaled the eventual outcome of the Pacific War. The final assessment of Operation Vengeance must acknowledge both its tactical success and its strategic limitations. The mission accomplished its objective. Admiral Yamamoto was killed. American morale increased. Japanese morale decreased. Code-breaking capabilities remained secure despite premature press disclosure. All pilots, except one, returned safely. By these measures, Operation Vengeance was an unqualified success. But Yamamoto's death did not change the strategic trajectory of the Pacific War. Japan continued fighting for more than 2 years after April 18th, 1943. Millions more would die before surrender in August 1945. The industrial and logistical advantages that made American victory inevitable existed before Yamamoto's death and continued after it. His elimination removed a symbol of Japanese naval power, but did not remove the underlying causes of Japanese defeat. Perhaps the most lasting impact of Operation Vengeance was demonstrating the integration of intelligence, planning, and execution that would characterize American military operations in subsequent decades. The mission required signals intelligence to decode Japanese communications, strategic intelligence to assess the target's value, operational planning to devise a feasible attack profile, technical capabilities to fly the mission, and tactical skill to execute the attack. Each element was necessary. None was sufficient alone. The synthesis of these capabilities created a new model for targeted operations against high-value individuals. That model would be refined through subsequent conflicts and technologies, eventually producing the precision strike capabilities that defined 21st century warfare. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.